All right, welcome back to from the break here. What we need to do now is start into this last bit of material. I think I mentioned at the beginning of the semester, this material does not fit very well into EBE. It fits better into a course like molecular and cellular biology. And what we're going to be talking about is a lot of the stuff that we did back in MCB, so be aware of that. I can do a little bit here at the beginning to try to ease into it, but I do recognize that given everything we've talked about throughout the semester, this material really doesn't feel like it belongs here, but it needs to be covered. Those of you taking a praxis exam, and there are a couple of you in class, this material is something that is covered on that. So the way to start here first is kind of what photosynthesis is. I mean, as a word, broken into its component pieces, photo is light, synth means to put together, and anytime you see sys, think it's the process of. So it's the process of using light to put something together. Really what we're going to do is convert energy into a different form. The form of energy that we're going to start with is light energy from the sun, and we're going to convert that into chemical bond energy. Specifically, the energy found within the bond between two carbon atoms, that carbon-carbon bond that we talk a lot about in MCB. Okay, so kind of as an overall process, this is what we're going to do. The organisms on the planet that can engage in this photosynthesis process are part of a few different kingdoms. The plants found in kingdom Plantae are involved in this photosynthesis process. There are a number of bacteria. The big group of these would be cyanobacteria, single-celled prokaryotes, many of them in the ocean, doing lots and lots of photosynthesis. And then the last group would be kingdom Protista, right? Things like kelp, the macroalgae, the browns, reds, and green algae that are macro, you can see them with the naked eye, and then what are referred to as the microalgae. These would be eukaryotes that can do photosynthesis, but they're single-celled eukaryotes. And because they're single-celled, they don't belong within kingdom Plantae. Now, these organisms that can do this process of photosynthesis, collectively, they're referred to as the autotrophs. Auto meaning self, and troph meaning feeding. So kind of the idea of self-feeding, meaning they make their own food, and then use this food, this stored energy as food, to do work at some point in the future. Okay? All right, the process of photosynthesis is a biochemical process. So anytime we do biochemistry, it's probably a good idea to start with exactly what we're going to do. So if we take 3 molecules of carbon dioxide and 6 molecules of water, and we do this reaction in the presence of light, it's energy from the sun, we can make I always have to think about this just to make sure I've got it okay. Balancing equations was never something I enjoyed in chemistry. There's 2 O's. So let's see, that's 3, 6, 12. It's 12 oxygens, 3 carbons, and 12 hydrogens. 6 and 6 is 12. So this is our generic equation that describes photosynthesis. Many of you in high school, 602, were given this equation that describes cellular respiration, and then chances are that you got this equation to describe photosynthesis. So this is kind of the high school approach to photosynthesis. You'll notice a few differences between this high school equation for photosynthesis covered in high school textbooks and this equation, which is a college approach here. So similarities anyway, we're still using carbon dioxide, which is inorganic carbon. And water and CO2 are used to manufacture, in this case, glucose. And this molecule here is called triose, 3 carbons, triose. I think the reason they teach this one in high school is you basically just flip the 2 equations, and then it makes people feel like, you know, these wonderful plants on the planet are producing food for us, and then we give off waste products that are then used by plants to make food, which we use, and then we give off waste products that really, the plants are not in the business of making carbohydrates so that we can use it. They're making carbohydrates so that they can use it. So this idea of this kind of mutualism between plants and animals, it's kind of silly. This equation is more accurate in terms of what it is that plants are making. Plants manufacture a 3-carbon sugar as a consequence of fixing inorganic carbon. In this equation, it looks like they manufacture glucose. Plants can make glucose. What they do is basically make 2 trioses and then take those 2 trioses and put them together to make a glucose. But you could also take 2 trioses and put them together to make a fructose, or 2 trioses together to make a galactose, or any number of carbohydrates. You could take a triose and add some fatty acid chains to them, and you've made a triacylglyceride. You could take this plus a few other trioses, some nitrogen from the soil, and you can make nucleic acids, nucleotide monomers, or amino acids, right? So this is basically what plants manufacture. They could use this to make glucose, but they also make a tremendous number of other biological molecules besides glucose. And then plants give off some water and also some oxygen as a waste product. This is an unusual thing to do in a chemical equation, but the point is these water molecules are not the same as those water molecules. Otherwise, we would just make this a 3 and get rid of that on the other side. They're different. These 6 water molecules are not. They do not include these 3. Okay? All right, so a couple things then that flow from this equation. The overall descriptor says you take inorganic carbon in the form of carbon dioxide and water in the presence of light, and then this carbon is fixed into organic molecules, and then the plant gives off oxygen and water as waste products. Okay? Now, on this side of the equation is the CO2. The amount of CO2 in the atmosphere right now is 0.04%, right? You listen to the news, you think we're drowning in it, but from an autotroph's perspective, from a plant's perspective, there's not enough CO2 in the atmosphere. There used to be a lot more about 450 million years ago, But plants took it all out of the atmosphere, fixed it into organic molecules that were subsequently buried underground. Some of these organic molecules in the Carboniferous period, when they were buried, ultimately ended up as fossil fuels, things like oil, natural gas, coal, etc. So they systematically took most of the CO2 out of the atmosphere, and it ended up being buried underground. So I mention this now, I'll pick it up later, but plants actually have problems associated with not enough CO2 in the atmosphere. They would like more. If you give them more CO2, they do better, they grow more, etc., etc. Okay, and certainly historically, in the fossil record, right, evolutionarily, there was a lot more CO2 in the atmosphere than there is today. Water. Now, water is used as a source of electrons for photosynthesis. We're actually going to do an electron transport chain a lot like the one that's done in cellular respiration by passing electrons between electron carriers. But water is also required for other things in plants. Cell division requires water. You need to expand the size of the cell, the volume of the cell during G1 in the cell cycle in order to prep the cell for mitosis. So water is required for that. We know that chemical reactions in plants, we need water present within the cell to promote dissociation of ions, to keep molecules in their proper forms. We know that water helps to keep proteins in the proper shape, right? They maintain their conformation because of the presence of water. So water has all sorts of requirements in plants, and in terms of the amount of water that a plant takes up that's actually used for photosynthesis, meaning of all the water that's taken up by the roots of a plant, how much of that water ends up being broken apart to release the electrons to drive this photosynthesis process. And that's less than 1% of the water that the plant takes up during the day. A good basic number to operate with. 150-year-old oak tree in Erie, Pennsylvania. It's well watered, has access to all the water it could ever want. Its roots are down under the water table, it has access to water. Of that water that it takes up, less than 1% of it is going to be used for photosynthesis. And then the question is, well, what happens to the rest of the water that the plant takes up? Well, some of it is used to make more cells, but the vast majority of it is actually lost by the plant through a process called transpiration. Okay? This transpiration process is where on the underside of the leaf there are all these tiny microscopic pores called stomata that allow for CO2 to diffuse into the cell. Into the leaf. Allow CO2 to diffuse into the leaf. So the plant opens up those stomata to allow CO2 to diffuse in. Well, the concentration gradient for CO2 is lousy. There isn't much of it in the atmosphere, and there's certainly not much of it in the leaf. So you're talking about a concentration gradient where CO2 moves very slowly from the atmosphere into leaves by diffusing down its very small concentration gradient. Okay? But there's a huge difference in the concentration of water in leaves, close to 100%, and that in the air. I mean, a humid day around here is like 40–50% relative humidity. So this is a huge concentration for gradient for water, which means whenever the plant opens up its stomata, CO2 comes dribbling in and water comes gushing out in large amounts. This water that's lost through diffusion is called transpiration. Our 150-year-old oak tree around here in Erie, Pennsylvania is going to lose about 80 gallons a day as water vapor through this transpiration process. Okay? So most of the water taken up by the plant is actually vented into the atmosphere because this is a natural consequence of trying to pick up extra amounts of CO2, which are very hard for plants to do. Okay? All right, that's the basic kind of equation that we've got for photosynthesis. I want to talk a little bit here about light. Light is electromagnetic radiation. That's EMR, electromagnetic radiation. This shows us the different types of electromagnetic radiation that are given off by the sun, otherwise known as the electromagnetic spectrum, right? All of this stuff is considered collectively to be light, right? The spectrum itself is divided up into these units, right, based on the wavelength of that portion of the spectrum. So light travels as both waves and particles. The waves themselves, if we measure the distance between the waves, this is what's called the wavelength. Okay? So we've got some waves that are very tiny, 1 times 10 to the negative fifth nanometers to 1 times 10 to the negative third nanometers. This portion of the spectrum is referred to as gamma rays. Then we have another portion referred to as X-rays. And we have another portion referred to as ultraviolet. Then this little narrow band in here that's referred to as visible light. So there's light overall, and then there's the light that we can see, which we call visible light. And then there's a portion of the spectrum referred to as infrared. Then there are radar waves, the broadcast bands, including FM and AM, shortwave radio, and then alternating current circuits, etc., etc. These are much longer wavelengths, right? Much longer wavelengths. That's 1 times 10 to the 13th nanometers. That would be within this broadcast band. Okay? At the same time, light travels in waves. There are also these little tiny particles of mass associated with the electromagnetic radiation. And these little particles